It's time to start looking at secondary dominants. Secondary dominants, what are they? Well, I'll show you. We've got a typical progression here. If you look at your progression chart, a 6 chord going to a 2 chord, going to a 5 chord, going to a 1 chord. This is in C major, so it's an A minor chord to a D minor chord, to a G major to a C major. Standard progression. And we know why the 5 wants to go to the 1. And the book tells us that the 2 wants to go to the 5, which it does. And part of it is this circle progression here, that upward fourth. But the rest of it's not very strong. It's stepwise, so it moves pretty naturally, but there are no half steps. There's nothing pulling. So we know composers. Composers will do anything to make something more interesting or create more tension or more pull. And what they suddenly realize is that I can create an artificial leading tone. I can make a half step from the third of that chord to that note there, just like I have a half step from the third of this chord, the dominant, to the tonic. All I have to do is put a sharp, change the 2 to a major, and now it pulls beautifully. You say, well, can we do that? Well, we can, because the note that goes to the F comes from an E, so it's a whole step up and a half instead of being a half step up then a whole. We can go wholes and half steps, so it sounds a little colorful. When we add sharps or flats, it's called chromatics. Chromaticism, or chromatic, is just the Greek word for color, so it adds a little color, a little piquancy, but it creates so much more tension and drives this 2 chord to the 5 chord beautifully. And why is that? Well, if you look at it, if I just take out all of this stuff and look at just these 2 chords, what they look like, if we're in the key of G, is we're going 5, 1. It looks like we're going 5 to 1 in the key of G. But I'm not in the key of G, I'm in the key of C. So we say that this 2 has become a 5 of the 5 chord in the key of C. So it's not a dominant. This is the dominant in key of C. This is a secondary dominant. It's functioning as if it's the dominant of another chord. And we write it that way, so we no longer call it a 2 chord. We say it's a 5 of the 5 chord. 5 of 5. 5 of 5. Because this acts just like a 5 chord going to the 1. So before I tell you any more, we have to do some more language work, terminology. There's a phrase called modulation. Modulation is when we change keys. So in a modulation, you go from one key to another, and you either stay there or you continue on to another key, but you don't come back to the original key. Not for a while. That's called a modulation. In a secondary dominant, you act like you're changing keys, but you come right back. You never really leave the original key. So you hint at another key, but you don't actually go there. So modulation, you go to a key. In secondary dominant, you simply hint. Now this is the secondary dominant, so this chord is acting like a tonic in the short term. We could call it a secondary tonic, right? But that would be too logical for music theorists. Instead, they say this chord has been tonicized. It has been turned sort of into a tonic temporarily. It's been tonicized. The process is ridiculously called tonicization. So we have tonicized the 5 chord by having a secondary dominant, a 5 of 5, and that creates tonicization of the 5 chord, and there's a progression. So we have a 6 that instead of going to the 2 goes to a 5 of 5. It can do it because it's related to the 2 chord. And the 5 of 5 will take us to the 5, because that's what it is. 5 of 5 goes to 5, back to 1. Now, I'm going to show you another one, so I'm going to get you so used to this whole idea of secondary dominance. Anytime a root has this relationship, a fourth up, this chord can sound like the tonic. But you can only make it a secondary dominant if you make a change to it. So if this were a major chord, it's just progression. But we have here a 6 going to 2. I can do the same thing here. I take the third of the 6th chord, which is a C, make it a C sharp, create an artificial leading tone. This is now, the 2 has been tonicized. This is now a 5 of the 2 chord, and we write it just like that. Whoops. 5 of 2. Secondary dominance. It's magic. Look at that. Not only so, I hope you understand this whole concept. If you don't, please text or write or call. We'll talk about it. But let's now look at what chords we can do this to and what chords we can't, and then we'll give you the solution to some of them. So forgive me for taking a moment, but let me put the major scale chords up here. Well, I'll just write in Roman numerals. So there's the 1 chord, a 2 chord, a 3 chord, a 4 chord, a 5, a 6, and then a 7 diminished. So first of all, the 7 can never be a tonicized chord because keys either have major or minor as their tonic. So this can't be tonicized. So the 4th below it can't be a secondary dominant. It turns out a major, there's no 4th below it anyway. It's a tritone. But that means that the 4 chord cannot be a secondary dominant. So we'll never see the 4 as a secondary dominant in normal major, and the 7 chord can't act as a tonic. Okay, the 5 chord can't be a secondary dominant because it's already a dominant. So let's see what we've got left. Well, remember we have to change a chord to make it a secondary dominant. So 1 chord normally can go to a 4 anyway. So 1 to 4 looks like you'd say secondary dominant, but it's not. So I'm going to put a question mark here. We're going to show you how to make that a secondary dominant. 2 is easy. Sharp the 3rd. It becomes a secondary dominant of 5. 3 is easy. Sharp its 3rd. It becomes a secondary dominant of 6. We always said 4 can't work, 5 can't work. 6 is easy. Sharp it. It becomes secondary dominant of 2. We just did that on the board a second ago. So if we're just talking about changing the minors to majors, all 3 minors can become secondary dominants. The 1 major is already a dominant, and then 4 has no place to go, and 1 is our only problem. So that's easy. But let me solve the 1 problem for you. Let's imagine I'm writing a dominant chord in the key of C. G, and another G, and a B, and a D. Well, if I want more power, remember, I turn it to a G7 chord. 7 goes downward, and everybody else has fun. Look at that. There we go. We go to tonic. I can do the same with a secondary dominant. So let's look at that 2 chord again. I write a D, and what I have here, a D, and an F, and an A, and a D. And then I sharp this and said the F sharp is going to go up to the G, the D is going to go to the G, and then we're going to have a B and a D, and there's our secondary dominant. I can also make this a secondary dominant 7th chord. Just put a C here. This is now a 5-7 of 5, and woo, look at that. Takes me to a 5 chord. So any secondary dominant can be a secondary dominant with a 7th. We can add 7ths to anything, but it acts just like any secondary dominant. Just make sure that that 7th is a minor 7th. That's all. That is a dominant 7th chord. Let's take a look. And remember, we have to alter some note, or else we don't know it's a secondary dominant. So let's look at that C chord. I have a C, E, put the G there and another C. There's my C chord. That's going to go to a 4 chord naturally. F, F, A, and C. Right? That's how it's going to go. Whoops. Yeah, that's good enough. Okay. That's how it's going to go. But that's just a 1 chord to a 4 chord. What happens if I change it by adding a 7th? Well, normally you'd add a 7th here, right? But that's a major 7th. That's the 1-7 chord. And that's a major 7th. But major 7ths don't make dominants. So we flat it to make it a dominant 7th. And now it is 5-7 of 4. And look how it works. Oops, the 7 will come downward by step. I'll make this guy go down here to the C. And F chord works perfectly. So one of the things about secondary dominant chords, we can always make them 5-7s instead of 5s of whatever chord we're going to. If we do that, the 4 still has no place to go. And a diminished chord can't be a tonic. The 7 chord can't be a tonic. The 5 chord's already dominant, but every other chord can turn into a secondary dominant. You either flat the 7 to make it a dominant 7th chord, or you sharp the 3rd to make a minor chord major. That's it. That's it. And then those dominant chords go to a local tonic or a tonicized chord, which then continues in the progression just the way you'd expect it to. Introduction to secondary dominants. Boy, I hope it was clear. See you soon.